All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the mind of someone pretty fascinating, someone who you, with your philosophical background, are going to find really interesting. Robert Grosseteste, 13th century, Bishop of Lincoln.
Yes, quite the figure.
Yeah, big kind of philosophical figure. I mean, back then, the lines between philosophy and theology and natural science, like, those were pretty blurry, you
Well,
know?
exactly, and that's one of the things that makes him so interesting, especially, for a philosophical mind like yours. Grosseteste really gives us like a window into how Aristotelian thought, the ideas of Aristotle
Mm.
were being received and reinterpreted in this medieval period.
Yeah, it wasn't just kind of like taking what Aristotle said at face value, but
No, it was a very active engagement.
yeah.
Yeah. A lot of deep thinking going on there. I mean, he was translating and commenting on Aristotle, also the early Greek church fathers. He was instrumental in, the rise of Aristotelianism in the West.
Really influential. And it wasn't just Aristotle, right? He was like pulling from all these different thinkers like Avicenna, Averroes, the Islamic philosophical tradition too.
Yeah.
But he wasn't just kind of like regurgitating those ideas, right? He was forging his own philosophical paths too. I mean, he developed his own theories of creation, even the nature of the physical world, and it was all based on like this central idea of light.
It's really fascinating stuff, especially, I think, coming from a philosophy background, what you'll find interesting is the sheer breadth of his work. I mean, he wasn't just like stuck in these abstract realms of metaphysics,
Well,
he was actually writing about natural phenomena, everything from like optics to the tides,
real world stuff.
alongside his more philosophical and theological works. And then, I mean, he even gets into the thick of things, practical and political, like he's dealing with pastoral care, and then famously even challenged the Pope, papal authority.
Yeah. You don't see that every day.
No.
Big personality. So we've got our guide today, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Robert Grosseteste. And what we're trying to do is, extract the most philosophically interesting bits from all this, right? Give you a solid, concise, hopefully grasp of like what were his big ideas and how do they still kind of resonate in philosophy today?
Yeah, that's the goal.
Right. So where do we even begin?
Well, given your philosophical background, I think a natural place to start is with probably his most innovative contribution, is metaphysics of light. I think that's where his originality really comes through.
Metaphysics of light. Okay. So like broadly speaking, he's kind of working within like an Aristotelian framework, right?
Yeah.
The idea that everything in the natural world, all substances are made up of like this prime matter, like the raw potential stuff,
Yeah.
and then a substantial form, the thing that makes it a specific kind of thing.
Right.
But then he adds in this thing called the forma corporalis, the bodily form. What is that all about? What does that do?
Yeah, that's a really important addition, and it's kind of a tricky one to get your head around. So he is working within that framework, right? Like you said, prime matter, substantial form, but then he's adding in this forma corporalis, this bodily form. And what this does, I think it's possibly a departure from the strict Aristotelian like monism of form. You might be getting this from thinkers like Avicenna or Evis, where you've got more than one fundamental form in a physical object. And so the forma corporalis, this is specifically what gives prime matter three-dimensional extension.
Okay.
It's what makes it a body. So like the firmament, the outermost sphere in the cosmos, that might just be prime matter in this bodily form. But then like something like fire would have that bodily form plus its own like specific substantial form that makes it fire. And so what that does is it really raises some, I think, really interesting questions about the unity and complexity of material substance, which is, a topic that people are still talking about in metaphysics today.
That is interesting. So it's not just like one form doing everything. It's like different forms have different jobs. And now the big thing, the really unique thing, is that he identifies this forma corporalis, this three-dimensionality principle, with light itself, lux.
Yeah. Light is fundamental.
Yeah. Now, from a purely philosophical perspective, why?
Well, he lays out this argument. It's pretty elegant, I think, in his work on light.
Yeah.
And he basically says, look, if you've got a form, and it's simple, right? It has no dimensions itself, but somehow it has to instantaneously extend this prime matter out in every direction, to create a body, something with size and shape. Well, what kind of form could possibly do that? And he says, well, it would have to have this unique power to multiply itself and also to diffuse itself instantly. And he's like, well, what does that? What has that power? And it's light. Lux, Think about, if you've got a point of light, how it just fills a whole room, instantly. It spreads out in every direction, and it's immediate. So he's saying there's something fundamental about light, that it can do that. It can actualize the potentiality of prime matter to be spatially extended, to actually exist in space in a way that, like, no other, sensible quality can do.
Yeah, I mean, like heat doesn't do that, or density, or anything like
Right.
that. So light isn't just a property of things. It's like foundational to how things even exist as physical objects.
Right. Exactly.
How does he then build an entire universe on that? How do you go from light to a whole cosmos?
Right. So that's where his cosmogony comes in. It's kind of like a thought experiment, right? He says, okay, so God creates this first form, light, this lux, within prime matter. And both of those things are simple. They're indivisible. But then, and this is a key move, he says, look, finite multiplication of something simple can't give you something with magnitude, something big.
Mm-hmm.
But infinite multiplication, that can. And so through this infinite self-multiplication of light within prime matter, that's how you get all these extended bodies that make up the universe. And, this, I think, raises all sorts of interesting philosophical questions about the nature of infinity and its role in creation, ideas that actually resonate with, later discussions in mathematics and cosmology.
Yeah, I mean, infinite multiplication leading to a finite universe, that's a big jump conceptually.
It is.
And he's even talking about like different sizes of infinity to account for the different, the vastness of the universe.
Yeah, he's got unequal infinity.
Unequal infinities.
Yeah. And that's a bold move for a 13th century thinker. You don't see that very often.
No.
And that's probably the first explicit time that that's been articulated in the Latin West. And this is what allows him to make sense of this idea that, okay, so this light is extending prime matter out into these bodies, but
Yeah.
they're all different sizes.
Right.
Right. So these infinities, he thinks, they can stand in different ratios to each other, numerical and non-numerical ratios, just like points in a line can. If you've got lines of incommensurable length, that relationship. So it's very mathematical.
Hmm.
So that's his cosmogony, and then he uses that framework to explain the structure of the Aristotelian cosmos, like, those nested spheres.
Right. The celestial spheres, the sublunary realm, all that stuff. How does light fit into that picture? How does that all work?
Yeah, so this is cool. So the initial, like, infinite multiplication of light, it expands spherically because that's its nature, right? It goes out in all directions.
Yeah.
And so what you get is the outermost sphere, the firmament. It's the most extended thing, and it's also the most rarefied.
Okay.
But light keeps multiplying,
Yeah.
right? That's what it does. And so the light within this newly formed firmament, it starts multiplying inwards towards the center. And he calls this inward moving light lumen. And he thinks this is like a spiritualized form of light. It's associated with the heavens. And as it moves inward, it kind of concentrates the matter below it. And so then what happens is you get this next sphere, another rarefied sphere, and then it keeps happening. So each inward multiplication, each concentration, you get another sphere. They're kind of like stacked up, and they're all made from this matter that can't be rarefied anymore.
So it's like a kind of crystallization process driven by light, but
Yeah.
inward.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And so how do we get the earthly realm, the elements? That's different from the heavens. So the lowest celestial sphere, the moon, it also generates lumen inwards, right?
okay.
But the lumen from the moon, it doesn't have enough like power to fully disperse the matter below it.
Ah.
And so what you get is the sphere of fire. And then the same thing happens again. You get air, water, earth. And so because the matter in these elemental spheres, it wasn't fully dispersed, it can still be, concentrated or rarefied. So it can change.
Right.
It can be altered, unlike those perfect, unchanging celestial spheres.
So our world, like the fact that it's imperfect, it can change, it can decay, that's actually because of the limitations of light. Like it couldn't quite finish the job down here.
Right. It couldn't perfectly order everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this whole framework, he uses this to explain motion as well. Why the heavens move in circles and things on earth move up and down.
Right. That's always been a puzzle.
Yeah. So the lumen within the celestial bodies, because it's fully rarefied, perfectly ordered, it has no tendency to, rarefy or condense anymore. So its only natural motion is circular. It's perfect. But the elements, they still have that imperfectly dispersed matter, right?
Yeah.
So they're subject to rarefaction, which makes the lumen go up,
Okay.
and condensation, which makes it go down. So that explains why things on Earth move vertically.
Huh. So it all comes back to light. It's like the fundamental explanation for how the universe works.
Right. It's this unifying principle.
That's a pretty ambitious project to like take this whole new framework and then integrate it with like the established Aristotelian view of the cosmos.
Yeah, he's like giving us a whole new ontology for
Yeah,
physics.
just like light is the new foundation for understanding everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, he also gets into some pretty heady stuff with mathematics, right? Like infinity and continuity. What are some of the big philosophical takeaways from his work there?
Yeah. So he gets into this, especially in On Light. And he starts challenging some of the standard Aristotelian views on infinity and continuity.
Right.
And I mean, as we were just talking about this whole idea of unequal infinities, that's a huge departure, right?
Yeah.
And it has a lot of implications for how we understand the infinite. He thinks infinite numbers can actually differ in magnitude. They can stand in these different ratios to each other. It's kind of like a premonition of some of the stuff that, mathematicians in the 19th and 20th centuries were exploring with like transfinite numbers. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty ahead of his time. So he's not going with Aristotle on like infinity being just this potential thing,
Yeah,
right?
he thinks it's quantifiable.
Yeah. So how does this tie into his understanding of continua?
Yeah.
Aristotle, famously argued that a continuum, like a line, it's not made up of indivisible points. Where does Grosseteste stand on that?
Right. So this was a really big debate. It's a continuum made of like these infinitely small points. And so Grosseteste, he's wrestling with Aristotle, but he wants to try to reconcile the two views. And he says, look, I think the problem is that we're using the word part in different ways. So Aristotle, he's mostly concerned with what he calls aliquot parts, right? Like if you divide a whole thing evenly, those are the parts. But Grosseteste is saying, look, indivisible points, they can still be thought of as parts of a continuum, just in a different, like, mathematical sense. They're not like measurable units in the way that Aristotle is talking about.
Yeah.
And he uses this really interesting analogy. He says, a point is in a line, quote, an infinite number of times, end quote, without making the line any smaller. So it's a way of saying that, yeah, continua are somehow made up of these indivisible things, but not in a way that leads to the paradoxes that Aristotle was worried about.
It's like a point is both in the line and kind of like everywhere in the line at the same time.
Right. It's a subtle distinction.
Yeah, it is.
Right. But it's an important one. And then this whole exploration of infinity, it circles back to his understanding of God, and specifically divine measurement.
Okay, how does that work?
Right. So he uses these unequal infinities as this like way to explain how God measures things. In his commentary on Aristotle's physics, he contrasts like human measurement with divine measurement. So human measurement, it's always relative. It's based on these external units, like, the movements of celestial bodies or something.
Yeah, we need a reference point.
But God's measurement, it's intrinsic. He doesn't need any external reference points. And Grosseteste suggests that God, he measures things by essentially counting the infinite number of indivisible points that make them up. So for us, a line, it might be impossible to measure without some kind of unit. But God, because he knows the infinite number of points within it, he knows its exact magnitude. And so what seems infinite to us is actually a determinate quantity for God. And this is how he explains God's, perfect comprehensive knowledge of creation.
So God's kind of like performing a divine calculus or something, like adding up all these infinitesimally small parts to understand the whole.
Yeah, it's kind of divine enumeration.
That's pretty wild. So we've got light, infinity, God. Now let's talk about creation, which is like a big point of tension between like medieval Christian thought and the Aristotelian view of the world. Grosseteste was a firm believer in creation happening at a specific point in time, right?
Yeah, he was a big proponent of temporal creation.
How did he square that philosophically with, the arguments that were floating around for the eternity of the world?
Yeah, this was a major issue. And, some of his contemporaries were trying to kind of harmonize Aristotle with the doctrine of creation, saying, oh, well, maybe Aristotle didn't really mean that the world was eternal,
Right.
trying to find some wiggle room. But Grosseteste, he didn't buy it. He was very critical of those attempts.
It was like, no, come on, guys, this is not working.
Right. Don't try to jam a square peg in a round hole. He saw a fundamental conflict there.
Yeah.
And so he really went head-to-head with Aristotle's arguments,
Yeah.
Specifically in works like Hexameron and on the finitude of movement and time.
So what were his big arguments against this idea that the world had always existed?
Well, he argued that the fundamental problem with Aristotle's position was a lack of understanding of what he calls simple eternity.
Okay.
This idea of God's timeless existence, right? That God isn't in time. There's no like before and after for God. And he acknowledges that, Aristotle and some of the other ancient philosophers, they had some intuition of this.
Hmm.
But he thought they didn't fully grasp it. And he says the reason they didn't fully grasp it wasn't because they weren't smart enough, right? It wasn't a failure of their aspectus, their reason. He says it was a misdirection of their affectus, their will or desire. And this is kind of like drawing on Augustine, this idea that if you're too focused on the world of senses, the world that changes, you can miss those eternal truths.
Yeah.
So you need to like orient your will towards the eternal.
Right. You have to be looking in the right direction.
Right, exactly. And so specifically with Aristotle's arguments against a first movement, right, why there couldn't be a beginning to motion, Grosseteste says, look, Aristotle's just projecting these temporal categories onto the very act of creation. He's thinking about it the wrong way. He says the before and after, when you're talking about creation, that has to be understood within God, a temporal eternity. It's not like there was some potential in God that had to be actualized or that there was some like time before God even acted. It's just a different category altogether. And he makes similar criticisms of Aristotle's arguments against like a first instant in time.
Yeah, Aristotle's logic doesn't apply to something as unique as like creation from nothing.
Right. It's a different kind of event.
Yeah. And this understanding of God's eternity, that feeds into his concept of time itself, right?
Absolutely. So he finds Aristotle's definition of time, the number of change with respect to before and after, he thinks that's really superficial. And it's just focusing on this like quantitative aspect of time, how we measure it. But he wants to get at the like deeper metaphysical essence of time. And while he appreciates Augustine's insights on time,
Yeah.
he wants something a bit more objective.
Okay.
And so his definition is famously dense. He says, time is the privation of the at once of eternity from the totality of being. So for our philosopher listeners, let's unpack that a little bit, right?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so he sees eternity as this like perfect, unified present. It's all at once. It's timeless. And so time arises because created beings, they don't exist within this like complete simultaneous presence of eternity. Instead, their being kind of unfolds as this like continuous succession of instantaneous moments, right? Each moment, each bit of being, it adheres to eternity, and then it's immediately replaced by another one. And this flow, this replacement, that is what we experience as the passage of time. Now, the present moment is just that like fleeting point of contact between being and eternity.
So time is kind of like this falling away, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a limitation of created things that we can't exist in that perfect simultaneity of eternity.
Right.
And so we get this like strung out, fragmented existence in time.
Yeah.
How does that connect with his view of like what it means for something to exist?
Well, so he connects the very being of a created thing to this relationship with eternity. For him, the existence of a created thing is its dependence on God. And that dependence, in his theory of time, it shows up as this continuous adherence to eternity. And it's a bit tricky here. Like, is it the existence itself that's adhering, or is it the created thing, the thing that depends on God? But either way, the core idea is that temporality, this like existing in time, is tied to the fact that created things depend on a timeless God.
Yeah, that's a really intricate framework for understanding time. Let's move on to another big philosophical puzzle, one that I think a lot of people find really intriguing: divine foreknowledge and free will.
Yeah, the classic problem.
Yeah. And Grosseteste tackles this in his work on free decision. He takes a pretty unique approach.
He does.
So how does he set up the problem? How does he frame it?
Well, he starts by just acknowledging this apparent conflict between God's, perfect knowledge of the future and the idea that our actions are genuinely free, that they could be otherwise. And he lays out this argument. If God knows for sure that some future event's going to happen, call it I, then it seems like a must happen.
Right.
Like God's knowledge can't be wrong. And so if God knows it, it must be necessary. And so that seems to eliminate genuine contingency. There's no other option. And if there's no contingency, there's no free will. And it's not just God's knowledge, right? He points out that you could make similar arguments based on prophecy or even just like past tense truths about the future. And he's very clear that he accepts this logical principle that, if a conclusion follows logically from some premises and the premises are necessary, then the conclusion has to be necessary too. That's how logic works.
Yeah, that's the classic dilemma, right? If God already knows what I'm going to choose before I choose it, how can it really be my choice?
Right. It's like we're all just actors following a script.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does Grosseteste try to get out of this bind?
So his solution is to introduce this distinction in the types of necessity involved. He's saying, look, the necessity that comes from God's knowledge, that might be a kind of necessity, but it doesn't rule out a different kind of contingency that's still enough for freedom. And so he introduces this whole realm of what he calls non-temporal modal notions. It's a way of saying that future events and statements about those events, they can be contingent in a way that's not tied to like how things actually unfold in time. And he's saying that this is the kind of contingency that we need for freedom.
So even if it's necessary, like right now, that I will do something tomorrow because God knows it eternally, in this other sense, this non-temporal sense, that future action is still contingent, it could have been otherwise, at least in God's eternal understanding.
That's the core of it. He's saying there's this level of modal reality that's outside of time and change. So these possibilities, they stay possibilities, even though God knows which one is actually going to happen in time. And this is, going beyond that traditional understanding of modality, which is
Yeah.
all about, what happens or could happen over time.
This leads us into his more general view of modality and God's power. It sounds like he's proposing something more than the standard, per accidens understanding of necessity.
Right. So he acknowledges that standard view where necessity is basically unchangeable truth over time.
Hmm.
And contingency is, when the truth of a proposition can change over time. And he even points out that in that view, all true propositions about the past are necessary because they can't change anymore. And all true propositions about the future, they have a kind of necessity because they can't become false before they happen.
Okay.
But he says that's not the kind of necessity that threatens free will. To deal with that, he introduces these non-temporal modal notions that we were talking about. They're not related to time or change at all. It's a really new framework. And he's building on some ideas that were already there, in thinkers like Peter Lombard. But Grosseteste, he makes it much more explicit, lays out a more detailed theory, and it's something that later thinkers like Duns Scotus would really develop.
And so this non-temporal contingency, is that grounded in God's eternal power?
Yeah. So how he defines it is it's based on this idea that from eternity, a proposition has this power to be either true or false. And ultimately, that power comes from God's eternal power to know or will. So non-temporal necessity, that means that a proposition doesn't have that capacity for different truth values, either with or without a beginning in time. And so he says because propositions about future free acts, they have this inherent contingency, that means that the events themselves must be contingent too.
Hmm.
And that's enough for freedom.
But the idea that God has these eternal powers, but like some of them are unexercised, doesn't that create problems? Especially since God is outside of time.
Yeah, it does. And Grosseteste recognizes that. And he deals with it by saying that God's powers to know and will, they're rational powers. And that means they have multiple ways of being expressed. So like the power to know some proposition, P, that includes the power to not know P. So when God knows P, his power to not know P, it's kind of like being exercised at the same time, just in a different way. It's not just sitting there unused.
It's like a power that includes its own opposite.
Right. The potential for the alternative is built right into it.
Hmm.
Now, this was a clever solution, but it wasn't without problems. Later thinkers, like Thomas Bradwardine, they would criticize this idea, how can an eternal power be exercised and unexercised at the same time? And Grosseteste doesn't seem to have responded to those criticisms directly.
Okay, so let's dive into his understanding of free decision and the freedom of the will a bit more. You mentioned that in the 13th century there was this focus on liberum arbitrium. What did that term mean, and how did Grosseteste define it?
Right. So liberum arbitrium, that was a key concept in these discussions of freedom. And it usually meant both, like the act of making a decision, the rational process of deciding, but also the capacities involved, like reason and will. And so on free decision, Grosseteste makes this distinction. He says, okay, so liberum arbitrium, the term itself, that really refers to the concrete act of making a decision, the rational act. But then the will is what actually makes the choice. The will is what accepts or rejects things. And so he's saying that, like, true freedom, it resides in the will.
Right.
And he says the will has this flexibilitas, this vertibilitas, which is, this ability to genuinely choose between alternatives. Reason, it offers advice, it presents the options, but ultimately the will is what picks.
So reason proposes, will disposes. And that ability to choose between genuine options, that's crucial. Right.
Now, he identifies reason and will with his earlier concepts of aspectus and effectus, right?
Yeah, exactly. So for him, aspectus, that's reason. It's about understanding, seeing things. And effectus, that's the will, the desire, the movement towards something. And he's saying these are fundamentally one capacity, just exercised in different ways. And so the freedom of decision, it boils down to the freedom of the will, this power to choose between these real alternatives.
Okay.
And this puts him at odds with some of his contemporaries who thought that you could have freedom of the will without the ability to actually will otherwise. They would use examples like, God and the angels, they're perfectly good, so they can't choose evil, or Satan, who's fallen, he can't choose good. So they're saying, look, you don't need to be able to choose the opposite to be free.
Hmm. So how does Grosseteste deal with that? So he says, look, the alternatives that the will is choosing between, they don't have to be moral categories like good and evil. He says the will has this fundamental capacity to just choose between, opposites in themselves, things that are just different, but not morally good or bad. And it's only when you relate those alternatives to God's will that they take on this moral significance. So the freedom of the will, it's about choosing among these morally neutral options. And what drives the will is what it perceives as naturally good. And he does think that humans are drawn to what they see as good. But he also says, kind of following Augustine, that we can't really choose moral good without God's help, although he doesn't fully explain how that works. And our capacity for evil, he attributes that to the fact that we're created ex nihilo, from nothing.
Yeah, the inherent mutability of created things.
Right.
So it sounds like he's closer to like what we might call libertarian free will today, this idea that you really can do otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's right. He's definitely in that camp. Although he does have this idea that the will can move itself. So there's a hint of this like self-determination in there too.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not just about having options. It's also about like the will being this active force itself.
Right. There's something about the will itself that has this power to choose.
Okay, let's move on to exemplarism, truth, and illumination. This is where we really see the influence of Plato and Augustine, right?
Yeah, this is very much in that tradition.
How does he bring these different philosophical strands together?
Well, so his exemplarism, that's his way of integrating Plato's theory of forms into a Christian framework. He's saying, okay, so Plato's got these forms, right?
Yeah.
But they don't exist in some separate realm. They exist as eternal models or reasons in God's mind.
Oh, okay.
He calls them exemplar or rationes. And these divine ideas, they're like the blueprints for everything that gets created. Host
Yeah.
speak.